Hi and welcome to my video tutorial on controlling exposure for digital photography. So what we're going to talk about today is exposure and the things that go into exposure of a photograph, what it means, how to control it, that kind of thing. It's a super short little video. We'll talk about some other elements in different videos. So what are the three things that control exposure for a digital camera? Okay, well, we've got shutter speed, which I'll just call speed. And we've got aperture, which is like the size of the hole in the lens that the light is allowed through. We also have sensitivity, which I'll call ISO, and that's how it's listed in your camera. So these are the three main elements that control exposure, and we'll have to have lessons, videos on each individual one later. But what I wanted to explain to you today is, for the most basic control of exposure, basically you're going to want to understand how to make it higher or lower in your camera. So these are the different camera brands that you might have, Canon, Nikon or Pentax, and they have different ways, different modes, but in most cases they're basically the same. The first one that you're going to be familiar with is the auto mode. This is where you're not going to have any control. Okay, so that's the mode where the camera's going to make all the decisions for you. And this lesson is not about using auto mode. So you're going to have to get into one of these other modes where you can control exposure. This bottom mode right here, manual mode, is really not the mode to be using in a lesson like this, because in that mode it lets you do everything as far as exposure goes. And so exposure compensation is kind of irrelevant in that situation. So what we're going to focus on are these kinds of modes right here. Okay, where we've got program mode, aperture priority, and shutter priority. And I'll talk about aperture and shutter priority in other videos, but these are the modes. You might just start in program mode, and that would be a good place to start. In program mode, it's going to allow you to do exposure compensation. So when I talk about exposure compensation, what am I really talking about? Well, this slide shows you the button, which is universal to all camera brands, that tells you exposure compensation. And so what you'll do while you're before you take a picture, or after you've taken a picture and decided you didn't like it, you would hold this button down, and you might use this wheel on the front, sometimes it's on the back, and scroll it left and right. There's different camera brands have different methods of applying exposure compensation, and it's going to add or subtract some exposure from the camera's metering method. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about metering, but basically metering is where the camera is looking at the amount of light coming through the lens. It knows the aperture setting that you've got the lens at, and it knows the shutter speed setting, and so it's deciding what is appropriate for the scene that you're looking at, and it'll set your shutter speed, it might set your aperture, it might set your sensitivity, but it's going to decide how bright the scene is. And what you do with this plus or minus button is say, okay, well, I see what you're saying, but I want it brighter or I want it dimmer than you think. So you're sort of overriding the camera's decision and saying, okay, I want it brighter than that, or less bright. So what are we talking about when we talk about exposure? Well, I've got some examples I just took a few moments ago with my wide-angle lens. This is a picture that I took from the top of the stairs with the camera in a typical mode, not automatic, and just let the camera do the metering of this image. And what you'll notice about this image, the important things to notice are outside, where the light is quite bright, I can actually see pretty well. This window at the top in the middle here, I'm going to make my cursor a little bigger so you can see it. That window is too bright. Can't really see what's out there, but in this case I don't really mind. And the lamp, which was another source of light in the image, I can see the detail pretty well on that lamp. But if my subject was the family down here playing a game, then things are pretty dim down here. I can't see a lot of detail in this chair right here. I can't see much detail on the coffee table. So the darker areas are too dark, and the lighter areas are about right. And that's what the camera is doing, is the camera sees everything in this scene, in the mode I was in, and it was trying to dim things down so that the very brightest parts wouldn't be too bright, which would be this lamp and this window here, and preserve a little bit of detail. Well, I didn't want that detail. I don't care about that detail. I wanted to see it brighter in the middle. So what I can do is I can plus up, add on some of that exposure compensation we were talking about with this button right here, and I hold that button down and scroll the wheel, and I go to the positive direction, and I added what we call one stop of exposure compensation. I'll explain one stop in another video, or stops, but in essence it holds the shutter open longer and increases my exposure. So now things are brighter. You can see I can barely even see the detail in that window anymore. I've lost some detail on the lamp, but I don't mind, because now I'm starting to see some colors on this table here. The different colors on the table, I can see a bit more detail on this chair. Now as it happens, things are getting a bit blurry down here in the subject because the shutter is being held open so long, but that's a side effect. In general though, the colors are better in the area of the photo that I'm calling my subject. One of the things you're starting to understand at this point is that there is no such thing as the right exposure. People talk about a scene being underexposed or overexposed, but that's up to you, the artist, the photographer, to decide what do you want to see in this picture, and what do you not care about, and you have to decide for the camera. If you leave it in auto mode, it's going to make that decision, and you might not like the result. And so looking at this, I thought, well, that's pretty good, but let's just demonstrate what a little bit more exposure would do. So that's this last third image. Now things are getting quite bright here, but in the dimmer part of the scene, I mean, this is a white, almost white carpet, so you know, depends on what I'm calling the subject, but in the dimmer areas of the scene, things are starting to get exposed quite nicely. Again, I've got motion blur here because the shutter is being held open quite a long time. But you'll notice in those areas that we first saw some detail, I now cannot even really see the lamp at all. It is so bright, and the window details are completely lost. Okay. Well, if I don't care about those things, then this is actually the right exposure for my subject. If my subject is the family on the living room carpet, then this is about the right exposure. Whatever pleases you is the right exposure, but in this case I would have needed to use more exposure than the camera would have given me automatically. If I was in auto mode, this is what I would have got. I would have gotten a safe picture with details and my highlights preserved, but it would have been quite dark and quite dim. So they have exposure compensation. It's not going to work in your green auto modes, but if you use some of these modes, like the program mode or any of the other typical modes that you'll end up using, you'll be able to do exposure compensation. So we'll have some other videos talk about these modes and aperture and shutter speed and other things, but I hope this one short video was useful.